Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing? Welcome to Redating the Gospels Without Apologetics. How is everybody doing? I'm Dr. David Litwa, and this is Redating the Gospels. So great to see all of you here. So great to have you. I'm absolutely thrilled to have all of you here, and I'm really honored and privileged also to invite many new folks. Some of you I know, some of you have been supporting me for, seems like ages now, and others of you are newer. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this webinar, and I really hope that it is very beneficial for you. What we're going to do here is we're going to have basically the first half hour. I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the secret of the, say, redating the Gospels, okay? And I think that this is something really that you won't find what I call YouTube deep. You won't find it on YouTube. This is something really valuable, and so I'm thrilled that all of you have taken the time to join me. This is Redating the Gospels Without Apologetics, meaning what's apologetics? Apologetics is basically the science of saying something which you are supposed to say, doing something which you are paid to do. There are people in the world today who are paid to support a certain line and a certain dating of the Gospels, right? There's a whole group of people in the world, a whole group of professionals in the world who are trying to date the Gospels early because it matters to them. It matters to them to date it early because earliness means that there's a better chance that the traditions are true. Earliness means that there's less time to forget stuff. Earliness means that you can have the eyewitnesses there writing the materials, and that can serve as extra verification. Now, as I said in my little advertisement, one of the things that drives me crazy about the New Testament is even though you've got this very strong apologetic tendency in the official version of say, Christianity, where you've got to say that the Gospels are within range of the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and that means you've got to all date them prior to about 100. That's actually really expected from certain scholars, right? And one of these I'll just mention. This is a book called Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament, and it's a comprehensive book put out by a conservative press, and everything is as early as it can be. So Mark is before 62, Matthew's before 62, Luke is before 62, John is between 60 and 70. This is the kind of stuff that literally drives me crazy because a lot of these dates, although they seem to be objective and based on arguments, they all have this theological undertone. There is a big organization out there, you may know it. It's called the church, which supports and pays employees to support a certain party line. And that party line is called a creed, right? That party line is called a confession, all right? And that's what is so problematic when academics then start replicating the traditional language about dating, not because necessarily they're bad academics, but because they simply replicate what's traditional. We humans, we are repeating kind of animals, right? We repeat stuff. And we don't think typically any more than we have to. So we repeat stuff that other people have repeated. And the more it gets repeated, the more authority that it gets. And that's exactly how it often works when you're looking at gospel dating. So the overall goal for this session and the overall goal for this course is simply to transform your mind, okay? So that you think in a professional and scholarly way about ancient history, about religion, about the New Testament. This is not just information, in other words. This is about setting or resetting a particular mindset, okay? And The specific objectives I have for everybody here today is I want to help everybody understand why these early and traditional datings are often flawed, okay? That's the first thing. They're very common. You know, we've got entire books that support the conservative low datings, and nobody, you know, writes an entire book supporting what I think are more respectable kind of datings. So this is everywhere. You know, it's everywhere on Amazon. It's everywhere. It's the things that come up on a Google search. Okay. Secondly, I want everybody to learn reliable methods for dating ancient literature. Okay, that's the second goal. All right, so this is broader than just the New Testament, but this will apply specifically to the New Testament Gospels. And third, I want everybody to get historical handholds for dating the four Gospels. All right, I want everybody to understand the process by which someone might figure that out. So I'm not going to tell you necessarily what I think are the hard and fast dates. Okay, so you're going to be very disappointed if that's your goal. But what I'll give you is something so much better, okay? I'm not going to catch the fish for you. I'm going to train you how to fish so that you can have the handholds you need intellectually to judge whether something is dated appropriately or not. That's the goal for this course. And as a bonus, I want everybody here to understand a bit about the role of Marcion's Gospel and Acts when it comes to the composition of canonical Luke. Okay, this is a passion of mine. In fact, I'm passionate about all of this, and I really want to bring this home to people because I see that, you know, a lot of people, at least as far as I can see, have the same kind of struggles that I do. And they have the same kind of confusion as to why there is this repeated traditional sort of dating that just, you know, and the repeated traditional sorts of arguments for those traditional dates. Okay, so what are we going to cover specifically? Well, so in lesson 1 today, I'm gonna give what I call the dirty little secret of gospel scholarship. Okay, this is something that you're not going to find. I mean, I'm 99% sure you're not going to find it on a simple Google search, and you're not going to get it by watching YouTube videos. This is very important. Okay, next lesson, what I call dating the Markan wave, and I'll get to this wave terminology later, but dating the Markan wave. And dating the Matthean wave is lesson 3. Lesson 4, we're going to date the Marcion wave, okay? This is something that not a lot of people do, but I think is absolutely necessary. We need to bring Marcion into this conversation, okay? Because Marcion is going to be the key to seeing especially the development of the later gospel literature. And then we're going to be dating the Lucan wave plus Acts, okay? And then finally, we're going to turn to what I call the Johannine wave, okay? So that's the plan. We're going to have 6 sessions. As for how we're going to do this, so today I just want to give you basically half-hour slideshow, and we're already 10 minutes into it. So I want to give you this, what I consider to be transformational information, okay? And then in the second half hour, I want you guys to tackle me with your questions, okay? And in the chat, you know, write, this is a question. And I definitely hope you brought like a notepad or something so that you can write notes, okay? Because we're gonna be going not super fast, but I mean I'm gonna keep a pace so that we can get to everybody's question. Let me talk about the problem, and then let me talk about it first of all in terms of myself. So sort of me prior to the PhD, prior to let's say around 2009, I was thinking seriously about, I don't understand why in every textbook that I read, why people come up with these very traditional dates and very traditional arguments. How do they come up with the particular dates of the Gospels? This was something that I was really thinking about. And why do they vary so much? Why is it that, you know, you can get a catalog of people that basically you've got, some people, you know, are out on a limb and they have these later datings, right? So 2nd century. Some people have what's called the intermediate datings, which is like late 1st century. And then you've got the real conservative folks who want to put everything in like between 40 and 62 or prior to 70. Okay, so how does that happen? Why do we have these three basic camps within greater variation? Okay, why do we have the early camp, the pre-70, the middle intermediate camp, the sort of between 70 and 100? Okay, and why do we have the later camp, the second century folks? Okay, why is that, and what's the sort of reasoning behind that? So these were sort of the questions that were percolating in my mind, and maybe have percolated in your mind. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about this amazing, sexy secret of contemporary gospel scholarship. It is simply this, okay? And I've got a funny graphic. Okay, early gospels aren't stable texts with authors. Okay, early gospels are not stable texts with authors. This is the great secret. All right. Now let's unpack this. Let's unpack what might be meant by this statement, because when we've grown up, everyone has referred to the Gospels as books. Okay, and you might have seen people holding up Bibles and saying that this is the pillar and ground of truth. So it's this kind of bookish understanding. The truth is in the book, right? The truth is in the book. So of course the Gospels are books, and of course people refer to them as the book of Matthew, or the book of Luke, or the book of John, or whatever. I mean, these are so common. But what actually is going on in early Christianity is that Gospels are in fact fluid textual traditions. They aren't actually hard and fast books. And this is something that is really, really hard for a lot of people to grasp, because we're in such a bookish culture, and we're post-printing press. So we always imagine the Bible as a book, and like a product, something that's published, and boom, it's done. And it appeared in October of AD 62 or something like that, and bada bing, bada boom, it was published. But that's actually not how Gospels work. That's how a lot of people would have you think that Gospels worked. And if you've ever seen one of these, this is a procession where Christians, particularly in often the Eastern liturgical traditions, they will, but sometimes Roman Catholics as well, they will have a procession in which they're holding up a book. They're holding up this beautiful golden studded, sometimes gem-studded book, and it's something contained, and it looks really fancy, and it looks like it's a definite product, and they venerate the book. They venerate the book. They even kiss the book. They uphold the book, and they follow the book as if the book itself was divine, right? As if the book itself had all like the spiritual energy of the cross or a crucifix. And this is how they treat it. It's the Holy Gospel. Okay, so it's a definite, discrete product. All right, that's how religious people will technically think about this. And this whole ritual is, I think, based on a myth. And the myth is simply this. The myth is that there was, in antiquity, such a thing as a gospel book. And I want to convince you today that in the earliest forms of the Gospels, there weren't actually gospel books with definite authors. Okay? That's what I want to convince you of. I want to make that case, and then I want you to fire back with questions for clarification or whatever. Obviously, bring your own questions if they're not related to this, but I want to make sure this is the main point, folks. This is the point that I want everybody to understand. There were no gospel books when the first Gospels were produced. How does that even make sense? Well, Gospels aren't actually the kinds of texts that have specifiable dates. Let me repeat that. Gospels aren't the kinds of texts that have specifiable dates. They are texts, right? They are texts. They're things that are written down on papyrus and on vellum, which is animal skin. They were written down that way, but they weren't considered finished products or books that were published with authors' names. None of the Gospels have names. Okay, you'll never open a Gospel and say, and read the words, I, Matthew, on October 25th, was recalling in my mind the sayings of our Lord Jesus. He never does that because he's not the author. There's no authors. The texts don't reveal who the author is. Now, of course, a religious person today would say, well, of course not, because the author was the Holy Spirit. But try to go back in time for 2,000 years, okay? When these texts were not sacred, when these texts were first put onto paper, and try to think, why would someone who was trying to support the truth of a relatively new religion and who thought maybe that it was good to write a text, even though back then it was extremely expensive, why in the world wouldn't they just reveal who the author was? This is like the great question, right? Okay, so the best that we can give, because of this fluid state of affairs, okay, because none of these texts were published as books with authors, that they circulated more as written notes, as kind of working notes, okay? Then the Greek word for this is hupomnemata, okay? They functioned as hupomnemata. They functioned as notes. And these, if you publish notes, it was understood in the ancient world that you would be able to take these unauthored notes and add to them or subtract from them or edit them and then pass them along. Sort of like the telephone game, okay? Sort of like the telephone game, where every time that you receive the message and you give it, you change it a little bit. You change it a little bit. And so in these early gospel texts, every time a saying or a story would be written, okay, people would string these sayings and stories together in the form of notes, pass them on, and then other people would change it, adding, deleting, refining. This is what happened time and time again. So what does this mean? It means that the early Gospels, even if you think they are first century, okay, but let's just say, they were written anytime between, say, 60 and 160, they are all more like waves than particles. If you've heard of this analogy from science, the particle is that contained unit, but the wave is more uncontained, right? The wave is fluid. The wave changes. The wave is like a string of energy that goes forward and is not contained, okay? And that's how these Gospels are when they are initially written. So no one in the ancient world is asking the question, when exactly was this Gospel book written? Because they don't assume that the textualized traditions that they are receiving are in fact finished books. And that's why you see a proliferation of Gospels and new stories and additions to new stories and revisions of new stories, because no one is assuming that these are contained units, okay? Between 70 and 150, really important point here, folks, between 70 and 150, the Gospels existed in titleless variant versions, okay? And get this, they're all titleless, and we don't have any manuscript evidence. We don't have any manuscript evidence for any gospel between 70 and 150. Now, I know that there are conservatives out there who might say that things like, P46, which is Papyrus 46, or the John Rylands Papyrus, which is P52, that these go back maybe, to the early 2nd century. That's all false, okay? I'm here to tell you, on good papyrological evidence, that that's all false, because the way that they're determining, but they can publish articles, right, and say that that's true, because the way that they determine the date of a papyrus is simply by evaluating the handwriting. And so this is called paleography, okay? And so what conservatives do is they say, I want to date this scrap of papyrus as early as possible, so I'm going to look for other examples that look sort of similar and that are dated early. And that's essentially what they do. But for all of these, and I'll give you resources at the end of this, for all of these, it is absolutely more convincing that all of our papyri, our earliest papyri, our very earliest, they don't date any earlier than the late 2nd century. And so you should be very wary of anyone telling you otherwise. Okay. So what were Gospels like? They were treated, to use an analogy, okay, I use the analogy of notes or notebooks, but the Gospels were treated more like shared Google Docs than they were literature, okay? So you know when you go and share a Google Doc, often the reason of sharing a Google Doc the reason for sharing a Google Doc is to be able to edit it at the same time as your friend. You might have a business partner, okay? And, you know, you might say, okay, here's a doc, we need to write this up, and I'm gonna send it to 3 or 4 different people, and you can all be editing it at the same time, okay? That's very similar to how the ancients treated gospel literature. They didn't receive it as this utterly holy book to which they couldn't add or subtract anything. No, when people received the traditions about Jesus, it wasn't sacred. It wasn't sacred at first, right? So what they did was they added and they changed it and they molded and they copied, and in modern terms, they plagiarized. They plagiarized like crazy. But in terms of plagiarizing, they also, it's not just pure plagiarism, right? Because the best plagiarists are those who improve on the text. I won't yet call it literature because it's not, you know, like Shakespeare's literature. But these early Gospels, they were not literature. Homer is literature, but these early Gospels, they weren't literature. Okay, so they were more like notebooks. Now that doesn't mean that they were poorly written necessarily. I mean, some of them by the standards of ancient literature were, and we have evidence that people utterly scoffed at them. But as they began to develop and take form, they did take on many, many literary qualities. And those who did, you know, write, reinscribe, edit, they weren't stupid people or poor Galilean fishermen. They were very smart people and very well educated, okay? So that's what's going on here. It's more like a Google Doc. So imagine the earliest Gospels as more like a Google Doc, and Christians treating it more like a Google Doc, okay? So here's a Google Doc. Well, you all know what a Google Doc is, I hope, anyway. But okay, so in this period, each scribe or tradent, a tradent is someone who simply rewrites and passes it on. Each scribe or tradent of the gospel becomes a micro-author, right? Because there are no Xerox machines in antiquity. So there's no way to exactly reproduce it. Like even if they tried to reproduce it in exactly the same, to produce an exact copy, they still wouldn't achieve their goal because of human error, right? We have 5,500, you know, conservative theological folks. They boast that we have 5,500 examples of the New Testament. Some of these, you know, mind you, are full of holes and the size of a credit card. But that's a well-attested book, they say. But what they typically don't say is what I think is the more important and the more interesting truth is that of all these 5,500 witnesses to the New Testament, not a single one is the same as the other, right? Not a single one gives the exact same text as the other, right? And that's the story of difference. That's the story of variation. That's the story which is utterly, utterly fascinating to me personally, maybe to you, I hope. So when everybody writes things down in the ancient world, especially during this early period, they don't have a problem adding their own 2 cents, right? If they know a story of Jesus, or if they think that they can do a better job, right? Or if they see a story that's embarrassing, right? They will take that material out. That's okay. You know, no one's going to yell at them, you know, because they're not destroying a published book. They are continuing on the fluid tradition and improving it. And they consider that their religious duty, you know. They're not doing it because they're trying to be better writers, but they're doing that to be more convincing, right? So if you have a story in Mark where it says Jesus couldn't do many miracles there because people didn't believe, well, what we call the Matthean and the Lucan wave, who's ever responsible for those revised texts, they take that sentence out because they don't want to have people think that Jesus was actually limited in his power. And they consider that an improvement. Okay, so that's how they work. That's a very religious way of thinking it. Okay, so why is it that everybody, we shouldn't do this. We should definitely not do this. But why is it that everybody, both conservatives and so-called liberals and good scholars and bad scholars and but priests and pastors, why does everybody refer to gospel authors? Why does everybody refer to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if all of these are later inventions? And they are, right? Why do we do that? Well, it's because we imagine these as finished books. We are all incredibly anachronistic. We are all incredibly guilty of anachronism. And we all are unconsciously or consciously supporting a church myth about the authors of these texts, right? Because the later church myth in the 2nd century wants to say that all the texts are written by one single author that are either apostles or sub-apostles, that is, disciples of apostles. Okay, that's the myth. And that's much later than the Gospels themselves. The oldest manuscript witness, get this, the oldest manuscript witness to the fourfold gospel is something called Papyrus 45, which is possibly the 4th century. Some people say it's early, but probably 4th century. Probably 4th century. We have a gospel text, also a Papyrus P75 that has Luke and John. That's also probably 4th century, and that's very recently dated by Brent Nonbury, and I'll tell you how to get to Brent's work at the end of all of this. Okay. What does a papyrus look like? What do the earliest gospel traditions look like? When I talk about papyrus, what does that actually look like? Well, many of you have seen it. It sort of looks like this. All right. Now, when people think of the first gospel literature, they probably think something more like this. The finished pretty book, which has got a nice cover on it and nice little illustrations and this isn't actually a gospel book, but it well illustrates the kind of gospel book you would see in the Middle Ages, where somebody worked on this, somebody made sure all the lines were even, somebody made sure that it had these bigger letters at the head of the paragraph, and it looked very nice on the page, right? But what do gospel texts actually look like for the earliest period? Well, they look like that. It's just like this barfed out script, which it looks like somebody wrote, often in a hurry, and it's hard to read, and there's no pretty colors, and there's no paragraph divisions, and it looks like somebody's notebook, because that's exactly how they thought of it. They thought of it as notebook traditions, not as finished literature. That's finished literature. There's the notebook. Okay, so all of these gospel papyri, there are earliest witnesses to the text, which actually aren't even that early. They still are in the notebook form. Okay, very important, very important. The earliest gospels were not published as finished books. They grew as textualized constellations of traditions. Okay, this point kind of sums up what I've been trying to say. Okay, so they aren't signed by an author. They don't have a publisher. They don't have a date of publication. They don't have any of that, and they don't have a stable form of text. They're all changing on every single transcription. Okay. Now there's a document that people say is 1st century Mark, and that's P137. It looks like this, and this is another case where the conservatives are trying to convince you that this is a very early text of Mark, and that it supports the theory that Mark is from the 1st century, and we've got the whole book of Mark in the 4th century. Whereas this is the only thing that remains of it. It's literally like That's less than the size of a credit card. And it's got a few lines on it. And it's only from the initial chapter of Mark. So we don't know what, we can't say that Mark is attested, right? Only these verses are attested. We don't know what they were attached to, right? So, this is another problem where, conservatives are saying, wow, the New Testament is really, really well attested. Well, bits and pieces of it, but 400 years before they even called it the New Testament, right? Consistently. So, these are the things to be keeping in mind. And it's not first century, I mean, the standard datings of this text are 3rd century and quite possibly 4th. But, you'll still find people trying to say, oh, this is from the 1st century. Do not believe them. Do not believe them. Okay? So when people are trying to say, well, what do I want to do? I want to find the original text. I want to get back to God's true word, and this is kind of like the desire of some people because they think that it will get them closer to God. I don't know. But we can't find an original text because that's long gone. We only have what might be called an initial text. That is the text that is the earliest reconstructible text, the earliest text that we can get back to. And that text, it's not 1st century, it's not 2nd century, it's actually 4th century. So all of the Bibles that you have in your possession, all the Bibles that you have in your bookshelf, all the Bibles that you have anywhere, the Trump Bible, the Women's Study Bible, the whatever Bible you have, the HarperCollins Study Bible, the, I don't know, the True Man Study Bible, I mean, there's a million Bibles you can get, but none of them go back to a text that's prior to the 4th century. Okay. And what's the 4th century? Well, the 4th century is 300 years after Jesus. Okay. So something important to keep in mind. When we date the texts earlier than the 4th century, we're not talking about stable things. We're talking about moving targets of textual traditions. Okay, none of this is stable. We can't point to anything that's stable. Okay, and to say this has a definite date, we just can't do it. All right. Now, to give you, we're coming close to the end here, to give you an example of all this, okay, one of the greatest examples is the ending of Mark. Okay, the ending of Mark is a really, really fascinating example. If you have a decent Bible, what I mean by a decent Bible is a Bible that will tell you that there's fluctuation in the manuscript. So most Bibles, they want to lie to you and say that, this is the holy word of God, it's never changed. But in good manuscripts, or in good Bibles, they'll tell you that there's manuscript fluctuation. And this really, really happens in a big way at the ending of Mark. And it gives you the sense of what I've been trying to tell you, that early Christians didn't treat these as stable texts. They treated them as fluid traditions to which they could add to, okay? So let me give you the basic story, which should be clear to most of you. But Mark chapter 16 begins with this: when the Sabbath came, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Jacob, and Salome bought spices to come and anoint the body of Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun dawns, and they were saying to each other, who will roll away the stone for us so that we can get inside? Now, get this. I'm going to switch to a non-majority manuscript. I'm going to switch to an old Latin text called Codex Babiensis, okay? And this text tells an interesting story. This, again, is Mark chapter 16. According to Codex Babiensis, we have, but suddenly at the 3rd hour of the day, darkness came over the whole world, and angels from heaven descended, and as he was rising in the brightness of the living God, at the same time they ascended with him, and immediately there was light. Now, I love this. I absolutely love this. And the person who added this, I think, had a real flair and a real talent. But you will never, ever, ever find this in your printed Bibles, even though this is one of our very, very earliest gospel texts. Okay? And then, in the same codex, the story of Mark that's more familiar to us continues. And, when the women looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, and yada, yada, yada. And the angels tell them, he's gone up before you in Galilee, and they run away and they're afraid. Okay. And then we find more variations in the ending. Okay. In some manuscripts, we find after the ending, fear sees them, or ecstasy sees them, and they told nothing to no one, for they were afraid. Clearly, someone was not really happy with that ending, because in many manuscripts, we find this ending. Quote, they briefly related everything commanded to Peter's companions. Okay. Now, this is fascinating because the previous line says they told nothing to no one. But apparently this ending was so dissatisfying to readers of Mark's gospel that somebody intervened and just totally contradicted that ending without erasing it. So in one ending, they didn't tell anybody anything. And immediately after that, they briefly related everything. So there you go. And then it goes on as saying that afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the holy and incorruptible proclamation of the eternal gospel. Now, the most familiar ending is this other, what's called the longer ending. And according to this ending, Jesus, having arisen on the first day of the week, appeared first to Mary of Magdala, from whom he hurled out 7 demons. And she went and announced to his companions, who were weeping and crying. And when they heard that he was alive and was seen by her, they disbelieved. Okay. And then this ending goes on, it's got some interesting features about Christians taking poison and snake handling, and the snake handlers absolutely love this ending. Okay. So this shows you, going back to this shows you that what's really interesting here is that when the earliest readers of Mark read Mark, the earliest readers of the Markan wave, let's say, when they read these textualized traditions, they didn't feel like they had to leave them alone. They felt like they could add to them. So this tradition of Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons came out, this is only in this added ending, right? It doesn't appear anywhere else. All right? That's fascinating. That shows you that these aren't the kind of stable books that people can uphold, as clearly datable. These were fluid textual traditions, which people added to. Okay. All right. There are 4 ways to date a text, and this is going to be my last point, and we're going to get to questions, okay, in a second. There are 4 ways to date a text, all right? Well, there might be more, but I'm going to give you 4, okay? You can look for internal references to historical events or persons, all right? You can definitely do that. If a text refers to George Washington, probably it's written, after 17 whatever, whenever Washington was born, okay? Problem here, you can fake it. You can fake it, You can fake, certain events, you can have historical fiction, essentially, all right? Okay. And you can try to get people to believe that this text was written, say, in the 1840s by one of Joseph Smith's companions or something like that, when in fact it was written in the 1960s or the 1990s. There's a famous case of this. Okay, so the next way, you could date the earliest manuscript, right? You could actually find out what's the earliest time this was put onto paper. Problem here, New Testament manuscripts, they're not early. They're not early enough to get us earlier than the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, okay. Another way you could go about it is intertextuality comparison with other datable texts. There are some texts in antiquity that actually have dates. They're like marriage documents, divorce documents, deeds, leases, so on and so forth. And if we can, this is how papyrologists work. They look at the handwriting on these other texts that are dated, and then they look at the handwriting on gospel manuscripts, okay? Problem here is that texts are fluid, that, as the tradition continues, people add stuff right into the manuscript, okay? So it's not This isn't a science, all right? This is not a science. A great case here, which was helpful in Nagamati, was that in Nagamati Codex 7, it had a leather cover, and inside the leather cover, okay, you had datable material like receipts and records that were dated, and the latest date in those was the year 348. So we know that the cover, at least the book cover for Nagamati Codex 7, had to be produced later than the year 348. Okay, so that's helpful. But I mean, it doesn't exactly say when the texts inside the cover were written. It just answers when they were transcribed for that particular edition. Okay. We can also look at linguistic measures, like the state of the language. Like if a text uses lots of ye's, hear ye, that might suggest Old English, like 16th century stuff. I don't know. If a text refers to y'all, it might be written in 20th century Alabama. I mean, sort of looking at that sort of stuff. But the problem here again is that people can imitate the language, and there can be shifts in the language, right? And in the register of the language. A great example of this is Lucian's Syrian goddess. If you've seen this, in the Syrian goddess, he imitates Herodotus. He imitates Herodotus, that dialect that Herodotus had, even though Lucian didn't himself speak in that dialect. He imitated that dialect to give it a kind of higher register and an earlier date. Okay. Go read that text. It's funny. Okay, and then finally, there's something called machine analysis, in which we can examine like syntactical formulae, like certain tics that people have, like depending on the culture and depending on the idiosyncrasies of the writer. These are the kind of techniques that are used to identify people who have copied or cheated on their exams or on their like term papers. There's actually like machine programs that you can use. But the problem here for the Gospels is that the samples aren't typically large enough to do that kind of stuff. Okay. And if you're looking at like how Matthew used Mark, well, yes, he plagiarized Mark, but most of the time he just replicates the Markan way of saying things. He will improve it with his own idiolect, that is his own way of saying things. But if he doesn't need to improve it, he won't. So it ends up being a mixed text. Okay. All right. Two further reading things, which I hope that will be helpful. So there's a lot of literature out there, so I like to tell people where to go. I like to tell people where to go, where they can get more reliable information about the Gospels. And if I had only two books to recommend, these would be those, okay? Matthew Larson's Gospels Before the Book and Brent Nonbury's God's Library. God's Library is all about papyri and New Testament manuscript discoveries, okay? Some of you might find that dry. That's okay. But this stuff is important to know, okay? So, I mean, he makes it as exciting as it can be, okay? Matthew Larson argues that, just as I've been arguing today, that the Gospels weren't books. And if they weren't books with authors, then they weren't datable in any kind of traditional sense, okay? That's the big secret. That has yet to percolate among gospel scholars and scholarship, okay? So these are the two books. I really, if you're going to go anywhere, I really recommend these. I'm going to switch over now to questions, okay? I'm going to switch over to questions. I'm not infallible, but I am very passionate about this material. And before I answer any of these questions, I just want to thank everybody here again for coming along. For me, this is, to give a little personal note here, for me, this has been kind of a long journey because, I really believe that education, particularly in religious studies, is really, really problematic today because a lot of it, well, frankly, we're being defunded, right, in a lot of places. And so even, traditional like state schools and secular universities, which would give good traditional religious education in religious studies, those are shrinking radically, okay? And they're losing funding and people are losing jobs, okay? So my kind of, and then the other thing is that the people who are really well funded, who are more of people who have a sort of a conservative framework, okay, and typical seminaries and theological schools, and then these people produce a lot of books. And they're very productive. The Zondervan kind of and the IVP. These publishers produce a lot of books in this field, and so you get a lot of sort of information overload that is often really it's just thinly veiled apologetics. So my mission, I think more and more is to really say to people, we've got to have reliable caretakers out there in the internet world, in the internet space, who are able to give more, shall we say, deeper than YouTube level information, okay, and would give information that you would actually receive in like a gospel seminar, okay. So this is the whole idea of this webinar, and again, I just want to thank everybody for joining me. Okay, enough of that. Let me get to questions. So your question is, what evidence, if any, is there that gospels like Mark were used as theatrical or oral readings as performances for large illiterate audiences? For example, I can imagine a curtain equivalent dropping after the short end of Mark, with audiences gasping then clapping. How does this change the way we think about them? I love the way you phrase this. This is great. I think it's a fantastic question. The first thing I would say is I think the metaphor of theatrical is really, really important. When we think of liturgical readings, that's really a form of a theater, right? When you hear the gospel read in churches, that's also a form of theater where they're trying to, and especially when they parade the book in, they have these rituals of veneration. And certainly, I think in antiquity, these texts were 99% of the time, they were not read privately, silently. They were actually read publicly and performed. Okay, so you're absolutely right you're on the right track. I mean, it wasn't like real theater, but the metaphor of theater or drama is very much apropos here. All of it is going to be oral. All of it is going to be spoken. So nobody's taking this home. Books are like the prices of cars today. So nobody takes their Bible home. They go to somebody's house and they hear it read. Okay, and yes, absolutely. So people in antiquity, they're not dumb. I mean, they know that all the manuscripts are different, right? and it's absolutely clear that in the case of Codex Babiensis, which I read, which has this wonderful added flair about how Jesus, how the angels came down and grabbed Jesus out of the tomb and brought him up, and there was light. I mean, I imagine audiences really enjoying that bit. I mean, I personally enjoyed that. You might have had some people in the room who were like, wait a minute, I've never heard that. I mean, obviously, you would have a variety of responses, but I certainly think that, yeah, you're definitely on the right track. And that again reinforces the idea that, Dennis MacDonald says the Gospels are definitely directly genetically influenced by Homer. I don't deny that in some stories, but where I really would emphasize is that, the way that ancients read Homer, they didn't really read him. They heard Homer orally performed, and that's exactly how they would hear the Gospels. So that's the medium. All right, thank you for your question. How does the writing of the Gospels compare to writings of Greek philosophers as far as not being complete, when earliest copies we have are notes from other people written 200 to 500 years later? I know the dates are not loaded, but curious. This is a great question, because if you think of Epictetus, if you've ever read Epictetus's discourses, they were written by a guy named Arian. And there's an interesting story about how they were actually produced. So Arian was in Epictetus's classroom and he was writing the notes, and somebody stole his notes. Or he doesn't know how someone got a hold of his notes. But basically someone got a hold of his notes and published them. And then Arian was like, oh, this is bad. I never intended that. But, it had a good reception. So he then put out a formal published sort of edition of his notes of Epictetus's discourses. Okay. And in the preface, he's like, okay, well, this is what happened. Somebody got my notes, published them without, my approval. So I'm telling you why I wrote it this way and why it's, in such popular language. I don't usually write this way, but I'm just trying to reproduce how Epictetus wrote, or how Epictetus spoke, right? Because Epictetus didn't write. So I think this is really interesting, so I think there's definitely a comparison to be made here with Greek philosophers, and some philosophers, actually most of them, just were dedicated not to write anything. Porphyry literally had to twist Plotinus's arm to actually write anything, and this was the attitude of most, because they felt like writing would produce a lecture that was inferior to the actual voice-to-voice, person-to-person lecture. Okay. Whether that's true or not, I don't actually know, but they do have a psychological point. So it's true of Galen. When people would go to Galen, the physician, they would take notes from his lectures, and then the notes would be published, sometimes years after the lecture. So this is a very, and you can get lots more examples of this from Matthew Larson, his book, Gospels Before the Book. So go check that out. Regarding your point, the gospel fragments as unauthored notes, this is similar to a common preaching technique in the 1800s known as laying down heads. These provided an outline for sermons that were largely oral performances from a mix of memorized text passages and improvisation. William Davis argues that this is how the Book of Mormon was produced. Joseph Smith Jr. used heads as an outline as he dictated to his scribes. Absolutely, that sounds right to me. That's right. Yep. And in antiquity, it's even more of an oral culture where performance and oral performance is part of being good and sounding smart, and nobody. Unless you were like a Homeric poet, you didn't actually memorize the stuff. You improvised. Yeah. What is the manuscript evidence or data that suggests that the Gospels were shared working documents and shared between which locales? Okay, so the evidence is the changes themselves. The evidence is Mark 16. The evidence is we have 6 different versions. We have 6 different possible endings of Mark. It's like a choose your own adventure ending. Okay, that's the evidence. Okay, because what does that evidence tell you? It tells you that they weren't treating this as like sacred and unchangeable literature. They were treating it as fluid texts that they could change at will to make it a better story. Okay, so that's the evidence. And the ending of Mark is only one example. There are many. So the manuscripts themselves, the variations in the manuscripts, are the evidence that the Gospels were notebooks, not literature. Now, they became literature at a certain point, but that's post-Irenaeus. And it's only with Irenaeus that he really emphasizes tracing them back to named apostles, right? Justin Martyr traces them back to apostles. He says that they're apostolic memoirs. But in terms of the if you know Greek, the kata Matheon, the kata Markon, the kata Lukon, the according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to whoever, that's Irenaeus. That's Irenaeus. Okay. Is this because of a lack of training? Later 8th to 10th century Muslim and Jewish scholars did create copies of their sacred texts with much lower rate of error, with no major innovation in copying. Yes, absolutely. I mean, once the church becomes a big, fat institution that's state-run and state-funded in the 4th century, yes, that's when you start getting really well-trained, paid scribes. And in fact, we have a letter of Constantine that says to Eusebius, write me 50 Bibles. I'm going to give you the equivalent of like $3 million. And I want you to produce 50 full Bibles for me. And so some people think that our Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, which are these full edition 4th century Bibles, were actually the result of this command from Constantine. So yes, absolutely. When you've got the cash, the scribes do get better. But even in these 4th century big fat codices that have the whole Bible in them, they're full of variation. They're full of variation. So they never successfully got rid of the variation, and they haven't yet today. You can pick up the NIV, the NRSV, the ESV, the New English Bible, and they're all going to say different things in Mark 16. And they all disagree about things like in John, like the story of the woman caught in adultery. Some put that in brackets, some leave it alone. They don't even tell you that it's not original. Some take it out entirely. So yes, there's difference even today. Okay, they never gotten over difference. Have you read Canada Moss's new book, Ghost Writers, Enslaved Christians, and the Making of the Bible? I have not. Okay, I have not. I have read the reviews. Okay, but this is on my list. Okay, I promise you. I promise you. A big part of my Patreon is reviewing really good books. I hear it's a good book, and I would definitely, from what I've seen, go check it out. It will at least be useful for giving you a better sense of how different and weird antiquity was from today. Like today we all write on our MacBook Pro, but if you wanted to write a book in antiquity, and you had the means to do that, yeah, you'd probably use a slate. Does the awkward grammatical ending to the standard scholarly ending earliest manuscript strongly suggest a lost ending? Some speculate the end of the scroll broke off. This is Mark 16:8. Yes, some have argued that. I think if you're reading Mark all the way through in Greek, you're not at all surprised that it's kind of an awkward ending. And the more and more people who have read it in the 20th and 21st century, they keep trying to convince other people that it's actually a really good ending because it's kind of like a cliffhanger. So I don't put much stock on like the lost last page. I mean, of course it's possible, but probably not. I think it is actually a nice cliffhanger. Yeah, definitely later Christians, they weren't willing to go for a cliffhanger. Just a comment on parallels with Hebrew Bible prophetic literature, such as Jeremiah, from an early collection of oracles, subsequent redaction and expansion over several generations, rearrangement of material, producing eventually different variant literary editions, Masoretic text, Septuagint, Qumran. Absolutely. Yeah, no, New Testament literature is not, it's not unique. There's nothing unique about it. This is a great parallel. The philosophical literature is a great parallel. The medical literature is a great parallel. There's lots of people who produce fluid textual traditions. I would say with the Hebrew Bible, this period of high fluidity was like, 4th, 3rd, 2nd century BC, where we see a huge amount of textual fluidity. They kind of, as we're getting into the 1st and 2nd century, they kind of get more and more kind of systematized. But that's also the time when these diverge, like the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch. They finally become fully recognized as different editions. So leaving aside the disparate ending of Mark, the Johanan Kama, or the story of the adulterous woman, can you say that our canonical gospel texts are not stable prior to the 4th century? How much deviation are we talking about? Is the textual instability more like a verse or two missing, or there are major passages missing, like the story of the prodigal son is missing from Marcion's gospel? That's a great question. I think it probably, like, if you're like conservative and every little change matters, then yes, I think a lot of these changes would be very, very significant. I think Marcion's gospel is probably the greatest example of textual fluidity. It doesn't have the prodigal son, probably doesn't have the Good Samaritan. It doesn't have any of the birth narratives. That's pretty significant stuff. It doesn't have the genealogy. It doesn't have John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. And yet that's the gospel that he's upholding as the original. And I think Marcion is a genius. He's really the guy who's like trying to make the gospels more and more into like stable books, right? and he's the guy who's saying, I've got the stable book. You guys have the weird fluctuating traditions, you know. But then when you look at his stable book, you know, it looks really different. It looks like a fluid textual tradition. So yeah, I think there's a lot of micro examples as you're going through these manuscripts. And again, um, I'd really look up the work of Brenton Ownbree, who does a lot of, who's really like a papyrologist and expert in manuscripts, to really fully answer this question. When we get to Marcion, of course, we'll get into the significance of these differences as well. So is your model of wave gospel composition similar to community authorship model argued against by scholars like Robin Faith Walsh, if you're familiar? And what are some of the key differences in your opinion if you don't agree with the community authorship model? Yeah, I don't think the communities write the text in the sense that like a church got together and like they had a committee and they all decided what the story of Jesus was going to be. But if we mean that the Gospels went through many hands, then yes, I support that model where they technically have many authors, what I call micro authors, many editors, many transcribers who added and took away stuff. So those editors or micro authors, they weren't all part of a community, you know, because they weren't even in the same time period. You know, they were writing at different times over about a 70 to 100-year period. So yeah, I think Robin has a point that community is kind of like a fetish word. We should probably use that a lot less. I do think that there were groups, you know, real Christian groups in antiquity, but yeah, I don't know how close they were, like psychologically or sociologically. As to your point about the Gospels being more like Google Docs, couldn't this be said about virtually any work in the ancient world up until modern printing? Couldn't this assumption be applied to works of Plato, Seneca, or Augustine as well? If not, why not? Great question. Okay, yes, absolutely. So you're right. I think this is a matter of difference of degree to some extent, right? So you've got, take Homer for example, or Plato. Like by the time, like maybe it took a couple hundred years for even those, you know, high author texts. And I know Homer really isn't an author. I mean, but for these like high class texts to get manuscript stability, okay, they attained a kind of manuscript stability that took several hundred years. I mean, particularly in the case of Homer, you know, Homer is a great example where they really worked hard, like in the 3rd century in Alexandria, 3rd century BC, you know, in Alexandria to produce a stable text of Homer. They really tried hard. Okay, so what the Homer that we read is due to those Alexandrian scholars. Okay, so yes, there was textual fluidity even for those high class authors until, you know, they got the academic funding and they had the paid scholarship and, you know, the clout of the museum at Alexandria to try to fix the text, right? So in that respect, it is similar to what happens, you know, with Irenaeus, because by the time you get to Irenaeus, he's trying to fix the text. Well, even with Marcion, he's trying to fix the text. He's trying to make it stable. And they never really achieve that goal, right? You're right. Before the printing press, I mean, it's kind of impossible to really achieve that goal fully, you know? I mean, let's face it, the scribe can sneeze and, you know, he'll make a mistake and, you know, it won't be exactly the same text. So, but by and large, there was a difference between transcribing Plato in, say, the 2nd century and transcribing a gospel text. Because the gospel texts were still more like notebooks. And we can tell this even by the medium that they chose. The medium that they chose was the codex. Okay, and the codex is It's like our book. It's like the book that opens up, right? But most high literature of the 2nd century is still written in scrolls. So in antiquity, if you're going to write Virgil, if you're going to write Homer, if you're going to write Plato, they all appear in scrolls. If you're going to write a divorce document, if you're going to write lecture notes, if you're going to write something kind of rough and ready, like a schedule or a tax document, those are all codices. Those are all codices. And what do the gospel writers choose to write on? Well, I mean, you'd think if they were aiming to be high literature, they'd all go for the scroll, right? Because the scroll says, yes, this is high literature. But 85% of the time, they go for the codex. And we don't exactly know why, but that's what they do. And that's, material evidence that they viewed this more as a fluid notebook kind of tradition rather than stable, high-class literary text. Are there examples of notes in ancient literature? Absolutely there are. Yeah, absolutely. Caesar writes the notes of the Gallic War, right? In Latin, that's called commentarii. In Greek, it's upamnemata. And yeah, there's lots of, unfortunately, these titles get obscured when they get transferred into English, but Epictetus' discourses, those are notes. Those are upamnemata. He says that right in the preface. Those are notes. So yeah, if you want to see kind of what I mean by notes literature, like lecture notes literature, read Epictetus's discourses. That's where I would send you. Or if you're a Roman, history buff and you like to see how the Romans committed genocide in France, the Gallic Wars, why not? Okay, does the fluid Google Doc theory also apply to Paul's letters? I think so. We see a fair amount of fluidity there, especially in Romans. Now, this is not a course on the epistles. We'll get to that. But I think especially if you look at Romans, Marcion doesn't have chapter 14, chapter 15. A lot of texts don't have chapter 16. I'm speaking in terms of chapters, but actually, these chapters aren't even defined until like the 16th century. So they all kind of look different. So we can tell, people are adding. A lot of people think that 2 Corinthians, like Margaret Mitchell from Chicago, she thinks that 2 Corinthians is actually a series of 5 letters which people have pasted together, which would indicate great fluidity. I mean, if you can think that, if your grandmother sends you 5 letters and you paste them all together, I mean, and you sort of change all the transitions, that's sort of odd, but that's how they apparently worked it. And why would they do that? Well, again, we'll get into this, but they want an edition of Paul that goes exactly to 7 churches, right? And they don't want to multiply the letters, so they feel at liberty to just sew them together. We'll get into that. Could you clarify why you are sure that the Gospels are 3rd or 4th century and not earlier? Okay, so I'm not a paleographer, but I'm pointing you to the guy who is, all right? Brent Nonbury, okay? All right, go check out God's Library. Great book, okay? Paleography is the science of dating these small bits of papyri because they don't come with dates. So the only way we can date many of these gospel manuscripts is by looking at the handwriting, okay? So just as like in today, you can become an expert in handwriting, like if you're doing police work, I don't know, and then you can become an expert in ancient handwriting, and that's called a paleographer. And so what those people are doing is they're comparing the hundreds and hundreds of other papyri that we have from antiquity, and they're saying what looks like what. What looks like what. That's the whole science of papyri. Okay, that's literally what they do all day long. I think it's really cool. I wish I had the time for it. But that's the science of it. They're only comparing what looks like what based on what century. That's all that paleography does. So, that's why the conservatives can try to look for examples from really early papyri and ignore the fact that it actually looks much more like samples of 3rd and 4th century texts. Yeah, it happens all the time. Be very wary. Be very wary. Um, and don't listen to me. I mean, I'm not sure, of any. I'm not telling you certain things. I'm telling you that the paleography itself is an uncertain discipline because it's all based on comparison of letter forms. Okay. Do you think the Quran was a stable text with an author? I know it isn't your specialty. Yes, and that's exactly why I have to punt. I don't know a thing about the Quran. I do not know a thing about the Quran, and I'm not going to say anything about the Quran. I mean, I don't think that it was stable in the first 100 years, but that's about all that I know. A lot of these books, it takes them a couple 100 years to get into a fixed form, and that's probably, I think, true of the Quran. But in terms of the details, I do not know. The book Redrawing the Boundaries by J.B.M. Sturdy is often cited as the book for the late dating of early Christian texts, including the New Testament. Is this book good and up to date, or are there better alternatives? Unfortunately, no. Why? Sturdy died while he was writing that book, and so they actually publish his notes. This is the irony of it. Here this whole lesson is about notes. And yes, go read this book by Sturdy. Yes, but know that he died writing it. So we're still looking for somebody. Maybe it's one of you, who will write the book on the late dating of the New Testament, an entire book. But yes, you're going to have to start with Sturdy. I mean, it's not a bad book. It's just unfinished. So why do you think the Codex Babiensis is not valid? It is valid. There's nothing unvalid about it. I mean, it's just a variation. It's just a really cool variation. Scholarship doesn't tell you what's valid or not. It tells you what's interesting. If the Gospels are fiction, what's the motive for taking the time and effort to make them? Well, I didn't say they were fiction. I mean, you would pass on a story, in a variety of ways. I mean, I think a lot of these people writing the stories and connecting them didn't necessarily think that they were invented out of whole cloth. Maybe they were, but I'm not taking a position on that at all. But why would someone take the time and effort to write these things? Well, it was very religiously important at some point to know the stories of Jesus. And I think one of the reasons, I'm old school in this respect, that I think one of the obvious reasons that people started to write down the stories of Jesus is because everybody that knew Jesus had died a long time ago. Even Papias is like, he wants to hold on. Papias is this early 2nd century figure. He wants to hold on to oral tradition when he's writing, like in Trajan's reign. But he knows that everybody's dead. You speak of Google Docs. Which other groups used in that time were using this type of notebook method of collecting a literary scribal tradition, perhaps of a spiritual kind, using micro-authors? You want comparable groups. Yeah, well, it's probably not comparable groups, but Epictetus's Discourses, Caesar's Gallic Wars, these are all notebooks, old notebooks. And people thought they could publish, republish, add, delete, and so on and so forth. I think the Gallic Wars is an interesting example because people agreed that it was written well, but it wasn't, they all acknowledged, and Caesar himself acknowledged, that it wasn't the kind of polish that would be normal of a literary text. So you can see Cicero's comments on Caesar's Gallic War, and this is what he says. Did first century people not think it was important to be accurate when telling people what someone else said? Well, I think that they did think that was generally accurate, but they didn't have the tools to know, what would be accurate, right? So, we take for granted things like, recordings, they did not have, I mean, they didn't even have cheap pen and paper, let alone, recording devices on their cameras so, yeah, I mean, if you're writing in the year 100 and you want to write a book full of Jesus' sermons, I mean, how do you go and verify that any of them were accurate? There's no recording, there's no newspaper articles, there's no diaries, there's no contemporary notes, there's nothing. There's only the passed on oral and written tradition. And so generally you credit that stuff, but you have no means of knowing its full accuracy. Where were these texts physically passed down in the early Christian community? For instance, were they passed down in house churches? Would they be housed in the Library of Alexandria? Well, probably not the Library of Alexandria. So that's the place where you'd find Homer and Virgil and Cicero, the high literary text. But yes, they were in houses, right? Most of them, usually rich people's houses. Absolutely. So among non-confessional and confessional scholars, what are their assumptions for methods of dating texts like Gospels that are common or dissimilar? Well, those 4 ways of dating a text. Actually, I think I gave you 5 ways, but those are common among confessional and non-confessional scholars. And the only trick is we use similar methods, but actually we come up with different conclusions. And this whole course, this whole webinar is going to tell you why. So stay tuned. Are we still thinking of authors using a text as a source or just alternative textual streams? For example, did Matthew use Mark, or is Matthew just a different developed text of the same origin? This is interesting because actually Matthew Larson argues that Matthew and Mark are too similar to be distinguished as texts, right? So if you think of a Venn diagram, almost all of Mark, besides about 8% of it, is embedded in Matthew. And so Larson argues that, when these texts didn't have names, when these texts didn't have authors, that they weren't perceived as different texts. They weren't perceived as different texts. Okay, now we can talk about that. That's an interesting theory. That's an interesting theory. And it's good to think with because it gets us out of the old ruts of thinking like, oh, these are distinct texts by distinct authors. That's not necessarily how an ancient person would think of them. Yeah. Regarding dating the materials on which texts are written, forgers are well known for taking or stealing older materials and forging their texts on them. Yes, Mark Hoffman. Yes, that's the guy I was thinking. The great sort of Mormon forger. Yes, absolutely. There were ancient forgers, absolutely. That's the case in antiquity as well, and it was even easier to do forgery in antiquity because there was less ways to check. Yeah. Thoughts on Tatian's Diatessaron? This is a good question, Jason. Yeah, I'm not sure where you want to go with this, but I'll just 2 seconds. Tatian's a great example of gospel fluidity, right? Because he's the guy who, even 170, sits down in Rome and he's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to defeat Marcion. Marcion says there's one gospel. I think there's 4, so I have the greatest idea. I'm going to make the 4 into 1. That's what Diatessaron means. It means the 1 through the 4. Okay, so he literally sews all the gospels together, and he knows that there's contradictions, so he removes, he adds, he deletes, so that he can make one big continuous story. Great example, even a decade before Irenaeus, of them thinking of the gospels as notebooks, not as finished books, right? Great example. Do we know of any other examples of Greco-Roman or Hellenistic Jewish literature that were written in the wave style? Absolutely. If you're familiar with the additions to Esther in the Septuagint, great example. Somebody just adding shit, to make the story better. Now, in order to get this, you need to get like the Roman Catholic Bibles, or I think it's in like the HarperCollins Study Bible. Or, of course, it's online. You can just type in Esther and the additions to Esther. Great example of that. Who could have wrote the original gospel text? I'm going to stop right there. There is no original gospel text. That's the whole point of the lecture. Does the knowledge of the Jewish scriptures suggest the original author was upper class trained? We have no idea. There's no original author, right? Right? Because the whole point of all of this, I'm trying to convince you, trying to convince you that these aren't the same thing as authored texts, right? There's no rich dude sitting down at his desk and writing out a gospel. There's some anonymous dude who passes it through 10 other anonymous dudes, maybe a few dudettes, you know. I mean, maybe there is some evidence for women authoring these texts as well. I mean, I don't know. That's the thing. Like, we have no idea. These aren't authored texts. They're fluid textual traditions. So yeah, there you go. Take it or leave it. I mean, you don't have to take it, right? And we can debate about this later on. You know, come next week. Try to prove this wrong. You know, this is the point. Let's let iron sharpen iron. What gospel does the text you read from Codex Babiensis belong to? So Codex Babiensis in its current form has half of Mark and half of Matthew, but originally it was a four-gospel book. It's our oldest four-gospel book in Latin. You can just Google it. It's a very interesting text. Can you comment on Marcus Vincent's notion that the four Gospels are written in the close temporal and regional proximity in the first half of the 2nd century with a kind of back and forth collaboration or even competition with each other, and all as reactionary to Marcion's Evangelion? Yes, that's a wonderful theory. That's a wonderful theory. I think it's quite creative, but yeah, he's failed to convince anybody, and honestly, he's failed to convince me as well. It's like he wants to fit all those four Gospels into one, like 7 to 10 year period with a fairly stable environment in Rome, it appears, and I just don't know. I mean, again, it could be true, but I just don't know. I tend to think that these texts were fluid for much longer. Yeah. And I also, I don't like this hypothesis of you know, everything being based on Marcion. I think it's kind of unnecessary. Marcion would have words for those people if he knew that they were just, you know, copycatting him. So yeah, we will have a lesson on Marcion, so bring this question back. I understand that Gospels functioned as waves of unauthored, unfinished working texts until the church-state funded version or authorized version. Do you think the same models apply to the letters of Paul? Well, people really want to talk about Paul. It's coming, folks. It's coming. I promise. I will answer this question because we're gonna talk big time about dating Paul's letters. Okay, that's coming. I promise you. I promise you. But I'm going to stick it to the Gospels for now. But please hold on to that question. Please hold on. I will get to this. As a former Muslim, my own unique insight into the Quran is that if you look at all the middle chapters starting after chapter 9 and how they keep repeating the same thing in prophetic stories with slight alterations, these are the variations of the same surah or chapter that were remembered or transcribed differently but were compiled together into a single book, and that the assumption is made that this is all revealed from God. The problem is that it makes the God of Islam the most oft-repeating God who could not come up with anything new and keep repeating the stories of a handful of biblical and some other prophets in Arab tradition. Well, you could be right. Again, I know nothing about the Quran. So you are my teacher today. What does the wave model of the Gospels mean for the synoptic problem? Well, it means that we've got to treat the synoptic problem a bit differently. We can't use flow charts where we have distinct boxes, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where we can have arrows pointing, you know. It has to be much more complex than that. How would the wave fluid text theory apply to non-canonical Gospels like Thomas, Infancy Thomas, Peter, or even Acts? Very similarly, yeah, especially Thomas, Gospel of Thomas. You know, April Deconic speaks of a rolling corpus. That's sort of like what I'm talking about, that the people who inherit the gospel, they just continue to change it and change it and change it and add to it mostly. Make it a better book. Yeah. You know, I think with the Acts literature, also very similar. Maybe by that time, because you're getting into the 2nd and early 3rd century, they're thinking more of more finished works. But yeah, I think, you could definitely argue for fluidity there as well. I believe it's the Acts of Timothy around the 4th century that describes authorship in a similar manner to compiling notes. Yes, I think you're right. I think that he was just being, a person of antiquity, definitely. And I think that's good evidence for how people in antiquity thought, yes. So how would the wave fluid text theory apply to non-canonical gospels? Yeah, in exactly the same way. I think the working notes model works pretty good for the Gospel of Thomas. I do. Yeah, maybe not for the others so well, but I think the Gospel of Peter is another example of, somebody just thought that they could make a better story using bits of the other stories. That's also the notebook model. Yeah, the wave theory. And can the changes in evolution in the Gospel manuscripts tell us anything about the theological evolution of early and later Christianity? Absolutely. I think, every change that they make is based on the social conditions, right? So, and the changing theology. So it's a bit like Ehrman's orthodox corruption of scripture, but basically everybody's changing scripture. I mean, we don't have to use corrupting, but it makes for a good book title. Perhaps a little farther in time, but in your studies of the tradition of the Coptic apocryphal and martyrological texts, there are similar fluid traditions. Absolutely, yeah. No, this doesn't stop. Yeah, it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop at all. And those would be also good comparanda. And Acts of Andrew and Philemon versus Acts of Matthias and Andrew in the City of the Cannibals. Yeah, I think a lot of these are seen as revisable texts. Yeah, people improve on these through the years, absolutely. Once the gospel genre became popular for polemical purposes, it's likely that the later gospels were written specifically to make a point and may not necessarily have gone through an editorial process the way the earliest gospels like Marcion Thomas and the four gospels did. Yep, maybe. Yeah. I'd like to know when you think that gospel genre became sort of more stable. But yeah, that would be somewhere in the 2nd century, probably later half. So many non-canonical gospels were 3rd or 4th century that they had less of a growth phase. Maybe, yeah, maybe. They were also passed on a lot less. If a book is really well read in antiquity, you tend to add to it. Yeah, it tends to change a lot. Yep. Okay. I believe this is the last question. Do you agree with Steve Mason on the dating of Acts after Josephus? Absolutely, I do. And our last lesson, we will get to that. All right. Wow, I feel this is a marathon. Thank you so much to everybody for giving all those questions. It's great to have you. I am so thrilled, and I hope that it is a service to you. And I thank you so much to all of you who contributed to making this possible. Okay, I couldn't do it without you. And I sincerely hope that we together can create something like an academic seminar and a community and learn from each other.